The morning wind came like a knife across the plains, slicing through wool and bone alike. Clay pulled his coat tighter and leaned into it, the breath from his horse, Slate, fogging in the brittle air. Frost clung to every fencepost like crushed glass, and the sound of the wind through the pines sang the same lonely tune it always had, the kind that makes a man remember things he'd rather forget. He rode along the northern ridge of his ranch, boots stiff, hands raw from years of work. The Donovan ranch stretched farther than most could see, rough land, half wild, half tamed, just like him. Clay had built it from nothing, plank by plank, sweat by sweat, after losing Elizabeth to fever 5 years back. He didn't ride into town anymore. Didn't drink, didn't dance, didn't talk. The cattle and the wind were enough company for a man who'd lost his reason to care. But that morning, something caught his eye just off the trail, a dark shape curled beside the frozen brush. At first, he thought it was a coyote carcass. Then he saw the hand. Small, brown, still. Clay swung down from Slate, his boots crunching through the frost. The figure was a woman, old, worn down by the kind of cold that kills slow. Her hair, long and streaked with silver, tangled around her face. Her skin looked like sun-baked leather, but her eyes were still open, sharp with a quiet strength. She didn't move when he knelt beside her. Didn't beg, didn't reach. Just looked at him like she'd already seen the measure of his soul. "Easy now," Clay muttered, pulling his saddle blanket loose. "Don't you quit on me, ma'am." He wrapped her tight and lifted her gently. She weighed almost nothing, bones and breath and stubborn will. When he set her across Slate's back, she whispered something, her voice brittle as dry grass. "I heard you wanted a wife," she said. "My daughter, she's perfect for you." Clay froze. Thought he'd misheard. But when he looked down, her eyes were steady, calm, almost knowing. Before he could speak, her head slumped forward again. He stood there a long while, snow whispering against his hat brim. Then he swung into the saddle, guiding Slate toward the ranch house. "Damn fool," he muttered to himself. "Can't just leave her out here." The ride back was slow, the kind where every hoofbeat feels like a heartbeat you're borrowing. The cabin smoke rose faintly against the white horizon, a thin thread of life in a dead quiet world. When he laid her by the fire, the color began to crawl back into her cheeks. Her hands twitched under the blanket, clutching something, a small, leather-wrapped bundle. Clay sat back, jaw tight, the flames reflecting in his tired eyes. He told himself he'd just help her get back on her feet, send her on her way. Nothing more. But deep down, under all that frost and silence, something had already begun to thaw. The fire had burned low when Clay Donovan stirred from his chair. Dawn slid pale and thin through the cabin shutters, laying soft gold across the wooden floor. The old Apache woman still slept by the hearth, wrapped in his saddle blanket, her breath shallow but steady. Clay rubbed the grit from his eyes and poured coffee into a tin mug. The taste was sharp and bitter, same as every morning, but something about the stillness felt different. Like the quiet before a change a man doesn't see coming. Outside, the frost was starting to melt into patches of mud. Clay stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking under his boots. Slate stood tethered by the fence, snorting clouds into the cold air. Beyond him, the pasture stretched wide, empty, endless, but his gut told him he wasn't alone. Then he saw her. A figure moved slow from the tree line, barefoot, wrapped in a tattered deerskin dress that looked more shadow than cloth. She walked with the steady grace of someone used to pain, her dark braids hanging heavy over her shoulders. The early light caught on her skin, warm bronze against the gray world. Clay's hand went to the rifle by the door, out of habit, but he didn't lift it. Something in the way she held herself stopped him. Proud. Watchful. Not afraid, but not trusting either. She came closer, the wind tugging at the fringe of her dress. Her eyes met his for just a second, deep, dark, and unreadable, and in them he saw something he hadn't seen in years. Survival. When she reached the porch, she didn't speak. Just looked past him toward the open cabin door where the old woman lay resting. "She's alive," Clay said, voice low and rough. "Barely." The young woman gave a small nod and stepped inside without asking. Clay followed, leaning on the doorframe, unsure what he'd just let into his home. The moment she saw the older woman, she dropped to her knees. "Mother," she whispered, the word soft but fierce. So this was the daughter. The old woman's eyes fluttered open. She smiled weakly and reached out, her cracked fingers brushing the girl's arm. "Willow," she rasped. "This man, he helped us." Willow turned her gaze toward Clay. Her eyes were calm, steady, but there was a storm behind them, a mix of exhaustion, suspicion, and something else he couldn't name. Clay shifted awkwardly, cleared his throat. "She was near froze to death. Figured I'd do what I could." Aura, the mother, as Clay would later learn, tried to sit up, but Willow steadied her gently. "Rest," the girl said, her voice smooth, carrying that strange blend of strength and sorrow. The cabin filled with the quiet pop of the fire. Clay felt like an intruder in his own home. He wasn't used to voices other than his own echoing off the walls. Aura's breathing grew shallow again. She turned her head toward Clay. "You have a good heart, rancher," she said faintly. "You saved mine. Let me repay you." He frowned. "You don't owe me a thing." But she smiled, eyes sharp despite the sickness. "My daughter is strong. She can cook, clean, work the land. She will make a good wife." Clay blinked, caught between disbelief and discomfort. "That's not what this is," he muttered. "I ain't looking for a wife." Willow didn't speak, didn't flinch. She just helped her mother lie back down, her expression unreadable. Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling through the cracks in the walls. Clay stood by the door, hat in hand, feeling the weight of something he didn't ask for settling heavy on his chest. He could have told them to leave. He should have. But as he looked at Willow, her bare feet on his floor, her hands trembling slightly though she tried to hide it, he knew he wouldn't. "Stay for now," he said finally. "Till she's better." Willow met his eyes again, steady this time. "Thank you." It was only 2 words, but they carried the quiet strength of a promise. Clay turned away, pretending not to feel the warmth creeping into the cold corners of his heart. The day stretched slow and gray over the Donovan ranch. The fire inside the cabin burned steady, filling the air with the smell of pine smoke and rabbit stew. Clay moved around quietly, boots heavy on the floorboards, trying not to disturb the 2 women resting near the hearth. The old woman, Aura, as the daughter had called her, slept most of the time, her breathing shallow but steady. The younger one, Willow, stayed close to her side, hardly speaking, her hands always busy with something, mending torn cloth, wiping her mother's brow, keeping the fire alive. Clay had seen tough people before. Cowboys hardened by the sun, miners with backs bent like horses, widows working fields alone. But this girl, she had a kind of quiet grit that got under his skin. He poured water into a tin cup and set it on the table near her. "You should drink," he said, voice low. She glanced at him, her dark eyes steady. "Thank you," she murmured, her accent soft but clear. He nodded once, not sure what else to say. Talking wasn't his strong suit, especially with strangers under his roof. When the stew was ready, he ladled out 3 bowls. Willow accepted hers without a word and helped her mother sip from a spoon. Aura's hands trembled with each movement, but her eyes stayed sharp, studying him between breaths. "You live here alone?" she asked quietly. Clay leaned against the table, crossing his arms. "Been that way a while." Willow's eyes lifted, curious. "No family?" He hesitated, staring into the fire. "Had one once. Lost her to fever." The room went still. Aura nodded slowly, understanding more than he said. Willow didn't pry further, she just lowered her gaze and kept feeding her mother. When the bowls were empty, Clay stacked them on the counter and pulled an extra quilt from a chest by the wall. He spread it near the fire. "You'll both sleep there," he said. Willow stood, helping her mother settle down. Her movements were gentle, practiced, the kind that come from long years of taking care of someone else. When she tucked the blanket up to Aura's shoulders, Clay noticed the faint bruise along her arm, half hidden by the torn sleeve of her dress. He looked away, jaw tightening. Whoever put that there wasn't worth the air they breathed. As the night deepened, the wind outside began to howl, pushing against the shutters. Clay sat in his old wooden chair, boots still on, watching the flicker of the fire. The warmth reached his hands but not quite his heart. Willow sat cross-legged near the hearth, the firelight painting gold across her skin. Her hair fell loose over her shoulders now, dark and heavy. She looked tired, more from life than from the road. After a long silence, Clay spoke. "You can stay till she's well. Then we'll figure the rest." Willow nodded without lifting her head. "We won't trouble you more than we have." "You're not trouble," he said quickly, then caught himself. "Just, not used to company." Her lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, more like a flicker of warmth breaking through the cold. "Then maybe we both forgot how to live with people." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing at all. The hours drifted by, the fire popping softly. Eventually, Willow lay down beside her mother and closed her eyes. Clay watched them for a long time, the old ache in his chest settling into something new. He told himself it was just responsibility, nothing more. But deep down, he knew better. Out here, where men grew old before their time and the land swallowed everything weak, finding someone worth saving was rare. And rarer still was realizing you needed saving too. Days passed, slow as sap through pine. Winter deepened, biting hard at the edges of the Donovan ranch. The air carried that kind of cold that cracked wood and made a man's breath sound like smoke. But inside the cabin, the fire stayed alive, steady, glowing, and quiet. Clay spent most of his days mending fences, chopping wood, and checking the cattle that grazed low in the valley. He was used to silence, but lately, it didn't feel the same. When he came back to the cabin each evening, he'd find Willow kneeling by the fire, her hands raw from washing, her mother resting nearby. She worked without complaint. She swept, cooked, hauled water, all while humming low, sad tunes that didn't belong to any him he knew. And every night, Clay would catch himself standing too long by the door, just watching her move in the firelight. He told himself it wasn't her beauty that held him, it was the quiet strength. The kind that had no reason left to hope but did anyway. One afternoon, as they were fixing the hinge on the barn door, Clay finally asked, "You ever think about going back to your people?" Willow's hammer froze mid-swing. For a long time, she didn't speak. Then she said softly, "We can't. We were cast out." "Why?" he asked, leaning on the post, his voice careful. She straightened, brushing dust off her hands. "They said I brought shame. That men looked at me too long, that I tempted them. That I was a curse." Clay's jaw tightened. "Sounds like their fault, not yours." Willow gave a small, humorless laugh. "Doesn't matter who's to blame when fear decides the truth. My mother defended me. That was enough to get us both sent away." Her voice was steady, but her eyes, those deep, dark eyes, held a hurt that didn't heal with time. Clay studied her a moment longer. "You didn't ask for any of that," he said. "No," she murmured, glancing toward the snow outside. "But a woman doesn't need to ask to be blamed." The words hung heavy between them. The wind pushed at the barn walls, whistling through the cracks like an old ghost. Clay felt something twist in his chest, anger, pity, maybe both. He handed her another nail. "You don't need to prove anything here," he said. "You're safe." She looked at him, long and searching. "Safe," she repeated, like she wasn't sure what that word meant anymore. Later that night, after the work was done and the lamps burned low, Clay sat by the fire, whittling a scrap of wood into a shape he couldn't quite name. Willow sat across from him, mending a tear in his coat. Her hair had fallen loose, and the glow from the flames caught in it like copper threads. Aura slept nearby, her breathing shallow but peaceful. Willow finished sewing and handed the coat to him. "You should sleep. Tomorrow will be cold." He nodded but didn't move. "You're different from what they said," he murmured. She tilted her head. "And what did they say?" "That you were a curse." Willow's lips twitched, neither a smile nor a frown. "Maybe I am," she said softly. "Everyone who gets close to me ends up losing something." Clay set the piece of wood down, leaned forward, and met her eyes. "Maybe you've just been around the wrong kind of men." For a heartbeat, they just looked at each other, the fire popping between them like a living thing. Then Willow stood, brushing the ash from her hands. "Good night, Clay," she said quietly. He watched her walk toward her mother's bed, the shadows wrapping around her as she moved. When she lay down, the room fell still again. Clay stared into the flames, the smell of pine and smoke filling his lungs. He told himself he didn't need her. Didn't want her. But deep inside, he knew the lie for what it was. The winter wind never really left the Donovan ranch, it just learned how to whisper. Some nights, it sounded like the old world calling back to the new. Those were the nights when Clay Donovan found it hardest to sleep. Aura's cough had grown sharper, dry and hollow like a shovel striking frozen dirt. Clay could hear it from the next room even with the fire roaring. He didn't say it out loud, but he knew what was coming. He'd seen the signs before, the fading color in her cheeks, the way her hands trembled even when resting. Willow never left her mother's side. Day and night, she tended the old woman with quiet devotion, washing her hands, cooling her brow, humming those soft Apache songs that sounded like prayers carried by the wind. Clay tried to give them space, but every time he stepped outside to chop wood or tend the animals, he caught himself glancing back toward the cabin. He told himself it was out of respect. But the truth was, he'd started caring more than he meant to. One morning, as the frost bit the windows, Aura called out to him. Her voice was weak but clear. "Rancher," she said. "Come here." Clay stepped closer to the bed. Willow looked up, worry shadowing her eyes. Aura's gaze locked onto him, sharp, unwavering. "You're a quiet man," she rasped. "That's good. Quiet men do what needs doing." Clay didn't speak. He just nodded. "You'll bury me soon," she said, her breath catching between words. "And when I'm gone, she'll have no one left." Willow's hands tightened around her mother's arm. "Don't talk like that." But Aura shook her head, never looking away from Clay. "She's strong. But she don't know how to stop surviving. You make sure she learns." The room fell still. Clay felt the weight of the promise forming before he even spoke. "She won't be alone," he said quietly. Aura gave a faint smile, the kind that knows the truth even before hearing it. "Good," she whispered. "That's all I needed." That night, the snow started again, thin flakes drifting like ashes through the dark. Clay sat by the fire, half asleep in his chair, when he heard a soft sob. Willow knelt beside her mother, her head bowed. Aura's hand lay still over her heart. Clay stood slowly. He didn't say a word. There were no words that fit moments like this. He placed a hand on Willow's shoulder. She didn't move, didn't cry out, just pressed her forehead to her mother's hand and whispered something in Apache that the fire swallowed whole. By dawn, Clay had already dug the grave behind the barn, beneath a lone cedar tree where the morning light touched first. His shoulders burned from the cold and the labor, but he kept digging. When it was done, he lifted Aura in his arms, so light it startled him, and carried her through the snow. Willow followed, silent, her hair loose and dark against the white world. They laid her down without prayer or preacher, just silence and the sound of wind through the branches. Willow knelt in the snow, whispering a final blessing. Then she stood, eyes dry, face calm. Clay covered the grave, each shovel of earth landing soft. When he finished, he placed a smooth river stone at the head. "She's at peace," he said quietly. Willow looked at the mound of earth, then at him. "She was never afraid of dying," she said. "Only of leaving me behind." Clay met her gaze. "She didn't." "Not really." For a long time, neither spoke. Then Willow stepped closer, her voice low but steady. "You've done enough for us. More than most would." Clay shook his head. "I ain't done yet." She looked at him, and for the first time since the storm began, her eyes softened. There was no wall left in them now, only exhaustion, and a flicker of trust. That night, when the fire burned low and the cabin fell silent, Clay sat in his chair staring into the flames. Willow lay on her cot, back turned, the blanket pulled to her chin. But the air felt different now, heavier, warmer, alive with something he couldn't name. Loss had taken root again on his land. But so had something else. Something that felt a whole lot like the beginning of hope. The nights after Aura's burial came heavy and quiet. The kind of quiet that seemed to press against the walls, daring you to break it. Clay Donovan wasn't a man who spoke much, but even he could feel the silence biting deeper than it used to. He'd buried plenty before, neighbors, ranch hands, even strangers passing through, but this was different. Aura's grave sat beneath the cedar tree, and every time Clay walked past it, the wind through the branches sounded almost like her voice whispering across the snow. Willow stayed mostly inside those first few days. She cooked when she could, cleaned the place top to bottom, and slept little. He'd find her sitting near the fire long after midnight, staring at the orange glow as if it held the answer to something she couldn't name. One evening, Clay came in from the barn, his shoulders dusted with snow, his hands cracked from cold. The stew on the stove was bubbling slow. Willow stood beside it, stirring, her hair tied back with a strip of leather. The firelight painted gold across her skin, softening the weariness in her eyes. "You should rest," he said quietly, hanging up his coat. She didn't turn. "I don't know how," she answered. He paused, unsure if she meant the words the way they sounded. "You'll wear yourself down." She shrugged. "There's nothing left to lose." That hit him harder than he expected. He crossed the room, keeping his voice steady. "You still got your life, Willow. That counts for something." She turned then, her eyes glinting with a mixture of sorrow and fire. "My life's been running from one place to another, Clay. Hiding. Surviving. That's not living." For a long moment, neither moved. The air between them thickened like the stillness before a storm. Then she looked away, ladling stew into bowls. They ate in silence, the crackle of the fire the only sound. When she finished, Willow set her bowl down and whispered, "She used to tell me that grief changes a person. Makes them either kinder, or colder." Clay stared into the flames. "Which one do you think you are?" Her lips curved faintly, though there was no humor in it. "Ask me when the ground stops feeling empty." Later that night, when the fire had burned low, Willow knelt by Aura's old blanket and folded it carefully. Then she stood, hesitating a moment before turning to him. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For not turning us away. For letting her rest here." He nodded, throat tight. "Wasn't something I could have walked away from." She stepped closer, the firelight catching in her eyes. "Most men would have tried." Clay opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, she leaned forward and pressed her lips against his cheek. It wasn't quick. It wasn't shy. It was the kind of kiss that said more than words ever could, warm, gentle, and full of things neither of them dared to name. When she pulled back, her voice was barely a whisper. "Good night, Clay." He stood there, motionless, the scent of her still in the air. His hand rose instinctively, fingers brushing the spot where her lips had been. He didn't follow her when she turned toward her bed by the hearth. He just sat back down, staring into the fire, feeling the ache in his chest change shape, no longer hollow, but alive. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and relentless, wrapping the ranch in white silence. Inside, for the first time in years, Clay felt something thaw deep in his bones. It wasn't love yet. But it was close enough to make him afraid to breathe. The snow began to ease off as February rolled in, leaving the ranch blanketed in thick drifts that caught the morning sun like sheets of glass. Clay Donovan was out early, breaking ice from the horse trough, when he saw Willow hanging fresh laundry on the line. The wind tugged at her dress, her long hair whipping against her cheek. For a moment, she looked like part of the land itself, wild, unbroken, and impossibly alive. It had been weeks since Aura's burial, and the cabin had changed in quiet ways. There was no longer just one pair of boots by the door, no longer a single plate left drying by the basin. Clay had never lived with anyone since Elizabeth, and sometimes the sound of a woman's footsteps in his home startled him more than gunfire. But he didn't mind it. Not one bit. Willow had started to fill the silence that used to weigh him down. Her voice, soft and low, carried through the cabin when she sang in her language, her words half prayer, half lullaby. Sometimes Clay would stop what he was doing just to listen, though he never let her see. One evening, as they fixed the corral fence together, she spoke without looking at him. "You never asked why I stayed." Clay drove a nail into the post before answering. "Didn't see my place." She paused, the hammer in her hand trembling slightly. "I stayed because I didn't want to be afraid anymore." He looked at her then, really looked, at the quiet strength in her shoulders, at the fire that still lingered behind her eyes. "You got nothing to fear here," he said softly. Her lips curved, just barely. "I believe that." They worked in silence after that, side by side until the sun dipped low and painted the sky in bands of orange and rose. When the last board was set, Clay leaned on the fence, watching her wipe the dust from her hands. She glanced up, catching his gaze, and for a second neither moved. Then she said, almost in a whisper, "If I stay, you need to understand something." He nodded. "All right." "I'm not broken," she said. "I'm tired." "There's a difference." Clay felt the words sink into him like rain into dry earth. "Then rest here," he told her. That night, the air inside the cabin was warmer than usual. Willow sat by the hearth, her legs folded under her, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Clay sat across from her, running his thumb along the edge of his coffee cup, trying not to look at her too long. When she finally stood, she crossed the room slow, deliberate. The soft creak of the floorboards filled the space between them. She stopped just a few feet away, her voice steady. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring. But for tonight, I'd like to not be alone." Clay's heart hammered against his ribs. He stood, unsure if it was right, unsure if it mattered anymore. Then he reached out, rough hands brushing her fingers. They stood like that for a long time, the fire flickering between them, the snow whispering against the windows. Then she leaned into him, her forehead resting against his chest. "I don't expect anything," she murmured. He tilted his head down, his breath catching near her hair. "Neither do I." When she lifted her face, the distance between them disappeared. Her lips met his, not desperate, not rushed, but certain. The kiss carried every unspoken word, every shared silence, every lost thing they'd both been too afraid to want again. When they finally pulled apart, Clay whispered, "You sure about this?" Willow smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "I've never been more sure of anything." That night, they lay under the same roof not as strangers, not as wanderers crossing paths by chance, but as two people who had finally stopped running, from their pasts, from their pain, from themselves. Outside, the cold raged on. Inside, something finally began to bloom. The days grew longer, and the snow began to melt from the hillsides, trickling down into muddy creeks that cut through the Donovan ranch. The air still held a bite, but it carried something new with it: warmth, promise, life. Clay Donovan had lived through enough winters to know when the season was changing, but this one felt different. The cabin didn't echo the way it used to. The silence that once followed him like a ghost had softened, replaced by laughter, by the sound of footsteps moving beside his own. Willow Blackhawk had filled the space between those walls without even trying. She mended what was torn, brought light to what had gone dull. And somewhere between the cold nights and the quiet mornings, she'd found her place in his world, and he, in hers. One morning, she stood by the window, sunlight streaming across her face. Her hair was loose, glinting brown and gold, her hands resting against her stomach. Clay noticed her expression, the way her eyes flicked between thought and wonder. He set his coffee down. "You all right?" She turned to him, a nervous laugh catching in her throat. "I think I'm carrying your child, Clay." For a long moment, he couldn't breathe. The world seemed to still, the wind outside, the crackle of the fire, even his own heartbeat. He stepped toward her slowly, hands trembling as he reached out. "You sure?" he asked quietly. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not yet, but I feel it. And I know." He laid a rough, work-worn hand over her belly, eyes softening. "Well," he said finally, "guess that means I've got more to live for than just the ranch." Willow smiled faintly, but tears filled her eyes. "I wasn't sure if you'd want this, after everything you lost." Clay shook his head. "Elizabeth's gone. That pain don't own me anymore. You do." The words hung in the air between them, solid and unshakable. He didn't mean them like a vow, but they felt like one. That evening, after supper, Clay went to the small chest beneath his bed and pulled out an old bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside lay a simple silver ring, thin, worn smooth by years of waiting. He sat at the table, turning it between his fingers before walking to where Willow sat by the fire. "I made this a long time ago," he said. "For someone who never got the chance to wear it." Willow looked up, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Elizabeth," she said softly. He nodded once. "I kept it all these years. Didn't know why, till now." He held it out to her, the small piece of silver glinting like a promise. "I ain't asking for a preacher or a ceremony. Just for you to stop pretending you don't already belong here." Her hands trembled as she took it. "Clay." He stepped closer, voice low. "I want you to wear it because you're my choice, not my second chance." Willow blinked back tears, sliding the ring onto her finger. "Then I'll wear it," she whispered. He smiled, faint and warm, before pulling her into his arms. They stood there a long time, wrapped in the quiet hum of the fire, the world outside fading into nothing. Later, lying side by side beneath the same blanket, Willow rested her head on his chest. "What happens now?" she asked. Clay brushed a hand through her hair. "Now," he said, looking toward the faint glow of dawn through the shutters. "Now we build something that lasts." Outside, the first light of spring stretched across the land, turning the last of the snow to gold. And for the first time since he'd buried Elizabeth, Clay Donovan felt the sun rise without regret. Spring came to the Donovan ranch like a slow breath after a long fever. The snow melted off the hills, feeding the rivers until they shimmered in the morning light. Green crept back into the world, cautious at first, then bold, like it was reclaiming what winter had tried to take. Clay Donovan stood on the porch, watching the sky blush gold over the ridges. He could smell the wet earth, the clean air, the promise of a new season. Behind him, inside the cabin, Willow hummed softly as she kneaded bread, her voice mixing with the crackle of the fire. He turned at the sound of her laughter, low, warm, and alive. She moved slower these days, one hand resting on the gentle curve of her stomach, but there was a peace in her now that he hadn't seen before. Life had a rhythm again. Morning started with the cry of crows and ended with the glow of lamplight spilling through the cabin window. Clay fixed the roof, repaired the corral, and worked the cattle. Willow tended the small garden they'd started together behind the barn. She planted beans, potatoes, and wild herbs, humming in her language as she worked. Clay would watch from a distance sometimes, leaning on his shovel, feeling something stir deep in his chest, a quiet joy, the kind that sneaks up on a man who thought he'd forgotten how to feel. The Creek Junction settlers rode by now and then, tipping their hats politely but saying little. Folks talked, sure, they always did. A rancher living with an Apache woman wasn't exactly common in those parts. But Clay didn't care. Not anymore. He'd fought storms tougher than gossip. One afternoon, while repairing a fence near the river, a wagon rolled up. It was Jed Harper, a wiry neighbor with a crooked grin and too much curiosity. "Clay," Jed called out, spitting tobacco into the dirt, "heard tell you got yourself a woman out here. That true?" Clay straightened slowly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "That's right." Jed chuckled. "She one of them Black Hawk folks from down near the San Pedro?" Clay's voice stayed calm, but there was iron under it. "She's my wife. That's all you need to know." The man blinked, then grinned, raising both hands. "Didn't mean no harm. Just making talk." He tipped his hat and rode off, but Clay knew how stories spread. That night, when he came in from the barn, Willow was waiting by the fire, her face half in shadow. "They'll talk," she said quietly. "Let 'em," he answered. "Ain't their lives we're living?" She smiled faintly, though her eyes softened with worry. "You've changed," she said. He chuckled, settling beside her. "Guess you did that to me." Her hand found his. "You changed me too." Later that night, Clay carved small wooden animals by the light of the fire, tiny horses, deer, a fox. He was shaping them for the baby, though he never said it aloud. Willow watched him work, her head resting on his shoulder. When he set the last one down, she whispered, "What are you thinking?" Clay's gaze lingered on the flames. "About what kind of world this little one's coming into. Hard land. Hard people. But maybe if we raise 'em right, it'll be softer for them." Willow smiled, tracing circles on his hand. "Then that's all the reason we need to keep going." The fire popped, sending sparks drifting toward the chimney. Outside, the spring wind carried the smell of rain and wildflowers. Clay looked at the ring on her finger glinting in the light. "You ever miss it?" he asked. "The life you had before?" She shook her head slowly. "That life ended long ago. This one's mine now." He nodded, the warmth of her words settling into him like whiskey on a cold night. In the distance, thunder rolled low across the plains. Clay reached for her hand again, squeezing gently. Whatever storm might come next, he knew this much. He wasn't facing it alone. Summer drifted slow over the Donovan ranch, coating the land in gold. The air was thick with the hum of cicadas, the scent of warm grass, and the quiet rhythm of a world finally at peace. The river ran clear now, reflecting the wide Texas sky, and the cattle moved lazily through the pastures. Clay Donovan sat on the porch, his hat tipped low, a half-carved toy horse resting in his calloused hands. His knife moved steady, shaving curls of wood that fell into the dust at his boots. Every now and then, he glanced toward the cabin door, listening for the soft sound of Willow's voice. Inside, she was humming. The tune was one he'd come to know, something old, something from her people. It drifted through the open window, low and sweet, mixing with the afternoon breeze. Willow was heavier now, her steps slower, her face carrying that glow that only comes with new life. She moved with a grace that never left her, though Clay swore the sight of her now could stop the world itself. He rose from the porch when he heard her call. "Clay," she said gently, "come feel him move." He stepped inside, wiping his hands on his trousers. She was sitting by the window, sunlight spilling across her hair. She took his hand and placed it on her belly. For a moment, nothing. Then a faint flutter. Life. Clay smiled, a quiet, humbled kind of smile. Strong one, he murmured. Like his father, Willow teased, her eyes warm. He chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Or stubborn like his mama. They both laughed softly, their voices blending with the sound of wind through the fields. Outside, Slate grazed lazily near the cedar tree, the same one where Aura rested beneath the earth. The stone Clay had placed there was smooth now, worn by the rain and sun, but the memory of that winter still lingered. Every time he looked that way, he swore he could hear her voice whisper, "Protect her." And he had. Weeks later, under a bright dawn, Willow gave birth to a baby boy. The first cry filled the cabin, sharp and alive, cutting through the quiet like a promise to the land itself. Clay held him in his arms, the small bundle wrapped in Aura's old blanket. The boy's tiny fingers curled around his thumb with surprising strength. Willow watched them both with tears in her eyes. "He'll have your heart," she said softly. Clay looked down at his son, voice thick. "Then he'll have more than I ever did." They named him Eli Donovan, after Clay's late brother, a name with roots deep enough to hold two worlds together. Days turned into weeks, and life settled into something simple and good. Clay worked the fields while Willow sang to Eli by the fire. At night, when the stars blanketed the sky, the three of them sat on the porch, the glow of the lantern wrapping them in its soft light. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Clay leaned back in his chair, eyes on the horizon. "You ever think she can see us?" he asked quietly. Willow smiled, her hand resting on his arm. "Aura?" He nodded. Willow tilted her head toward the sky, where the first stars were beginning to bloom. "She can. And she's proud." For a long time, they said nothing. The ranch stretched before them, fields, cattle, the whispering river. The land that had once felt empty was now alive with laughter and footsteps and hope. Clay reached for her hand. "For the first time," he said, "I ain't looking back." Willow smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Then let's keep building forward." The light faded, the world turning soft and blue. Crickets sang, and the wind carried a faint echo of the past, gentle, peaceful, gone. Clay Donovan closed his eyes, listening to the quiet heartbeat of his land, his family, his life. After all the loss, the cold, and the silence, the rancher had finally found his home. And you? If life gave you a second chance to love again after everything you'd lost, would you have the courage to take it?